Hey everybody, this is Russ from RetroGamecore. So I've mentioned it in several different videos, but my favorite device of this current generation, so the devices that have come out in late 2020 all the way up to today, is the RGB10 Max. This is a device made by PowKiddy. It's 5 inches in its display, and it has the same chipset as all the other devices that have come out this year, but I really like the form factor, the buttons are pretty good, and just overall, it's one of my favorite devices. Now, a buddy of mine, he also got an RGB10 Max, but he accidentally spilled water on it, and it got all these lines on it. You can see them here. It basically is unusable. The display needs to be replaced, and he's not very good at putting things together, so he asked me, he said, hey, if I send you the device and if I send you the screen, will you put it all together? And I thought, sure. And while I'm at it, I might as well soup it up as well. So in this video today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the device, I'm going to replace the screen, we'll do that really quickly, and then I'm going to create a starter guide. So if you're brand new to buying an RGB10 Max, this is the video for you because it's going to show you how to get from 0 to hero in about 20 minutes. So the only tools you're really going to need are going to be a replacement micro SD card, just because the ones that come with the device are pretty crappy. And then you're also going to want to have a micro SD card reader. These little USB dongles here allow you to put a micro SD card inside and then plug it into your computer. Those are the only things you're going to need to get started here on this guide. And like with all of my videos, I'm going to have a written guide in the video description so you can go through that at your own pace. And it's going to have all sorts of helpful tips, for example, which micro SD cards I recommend, or where you can find this USB reader, things like that. Anyway, without any further delay, let's just dive into it. Okay, the first thing is I want to do a quick update. As of today, they've made the PowKiddy RGB10 Max 2. Now, this device is the exact same as the RGB10 Max, at least internally. And on top of that, it has new colors as well. Now, they've made some hardware tweaks to it. For example, it now has stacked shoulder buttons. I'm excited to see how these work out. On top of that, they've made some ergonomic design choices, and so it might be actually a little bit more comfortable to hold. But otherwise, everything is the exact same, so this starter guide is going to work on this device as well. One other note is they say it does have a brighter display now, so I'm interested to see how that's going to play out. Either way, I did purchase one myself, so I'll be sure to do an impressions video once it arrives. And I'll have a non-affiliate link in the video description in case you want to buy one yourself, but be sure to use the code PowKiddy to get $10 off that order. So that's the first order of business. The other thing I want to bring up is that I totally lied about changing the screen in this video here. I did film the entire process, but after editing it down, I did find that it was about 10 minutes long. And so because of that, I'll put it in a separate video which I'll release tomorrow, so if you do want to see how to replace a screen on this device, it won't be in this video, but you'll find it in the next one. So with all that being said, let's actually set up the RGB10 Max. Make sure you have a new SD card as well as an SD card reader. And like I said in the intro, if you follow the written guide in the video description, it'll have buying links for any of these. Now, if you bought an RGB10 Max, chances are it came with an SD card. And typically these are going to be generic or rip-off SD cards that don't have a lot of good games on it, but there are some files we need inside of them. So let's plug this into our computer using that USB adapter and grab some of those files. When you first plug it in, you're going to see two different partitions that are going to pop up on your computer. If you don't see both of these partitions, let me show you how to have that enabled on a Windows computer. What you want to do is go into the Windows Start menu and type in the word Disk Management. This is going to pull up this app here, and here you can see the SD card and it'll show all of the different partitions. And if any of those partitions are not showing up, especially the EEROMs one, you need to assign a drive letter to it. After you go into the menu and you add a drive letter, it'll now appear on your computer. But for me, it already is showing up, so this is it right here. Now the files we want to grab are these files here. These are called BIOS files. These are required system files to play certain emulators like PS1 or Game Boy Advance. So what you want to do is take that BIOS folder and move it somewhere on your computer for safekeeping. Now, if for some reason you don't have access to this BIOS folder, you're going to have to find them on your own due to copyright reasons. But finding a RetroARch BIOS pack online is relatively easy. Now within each of these folders, you may find some game files, and potentially you could actually save all of these games as well. But honestly, I don't recommend that. I recommend you make your own ROM library, and in this video I'll show you how to add your own files to the new operating system. Okay, so after you've saved off those BIOS files, you can actually eject this SD card. We're not going to need it anymore. So now let's talk about the operating system. There are two options that you have available. The first one is called emulators, and this essentially is what actually comes shipped with the device. And while emulators works out of the box for this device, it's actually not officially supported by this development team. The thing is, they developed this firmware for a different device, one called the ODROID Go Super. And because the RGB10 Max is basically a clone of that device, this operating system will work on the RGB10 Max as well. But as a whole, given the fact that the development team does not support this device officially, I would recommend using a different operating system instead, and that one is called RetroOZ. Now, RetroOZ is actually a fork of RetroOS, which is a popular operating system for other similar devices, but this one is specifically made for both the ODROID Go Super and the RGB10 Max. In the written guide in my video description, I'll have links to this page where you can download the operating system directly from the website. Once you've downloaded the operating system, go ahead and use something like WinRAR or 7-zip to unzip that file. Next, you'll be left with a .img file. This is what we're going to flash to a new SD card. So plug in that new SD card, and then we'll use some special software to flash this onto that card. You have several different options. Today we're going to use one called Balena Etcher, but you could also use one called Rufus or Win32 Disk Imager. It's all going to be up to you. They all pretty much do the same thing. Once you download and install Balena Etcher, go ahead and open it up, and then select Flash from File. Here we're going to find that RetroOZ image file, and then make sure that we are directing it towards the SD card, and then select Flash. It's going to ask you, do you really want to do this? And you say, yeah man, I want to do it. It'll take a few minutes to flash, and then Balena Etcher will also validate it to make sure it flashed correctly. And then you're actually good to go. It'll automatically eject the card, so at that point you just need to pull it out and put it into the RGB10 Max. Now this step is important. This is the first thing you want to do because it's going to resize the partitions within the SD card so that you can use all the available space on that card. Now this process will also take a few minutes, so kick back, maybe grab a cup of tea. But once you're done, you'll be greeted with the RetroOZ interface. At this point, we want to put the card back into our computer. So press Start to get into the main menu, then go to Quit and Shut Down System. Once the device is turned off, let's go ahead and eject the SD card again, and we'll put it back into our computer. Now, back on our computer, we're going to see two different partitions, one called Boot and the other one called ROMs. Now, the ROMs one is the one we want to access. The first thing we want to do is go into the BIOS folder, and then we'll move over all those BIOS files that we saved earlier. This will allow us to play any of those systems that require BIOS files. It's going to ask you at one point if you want to replace some of the files that are already in the folder. I recommend selecting Skip for that one. Now earlier I mentioned that RetroOZ is a fork of RetroOS. And so because of that, the best place to find information on where to put your game files is actually the RetroOS webpage. And I'll have all this linked and explained in the written guide. But essentially you want to go to this page and then find the system you want to add games for, and then look at what file extensions are accepted and whether or not there are any specific BIOS files that are needed as well. So I would recommend leaving this window open as you start moving over your files to make sure you're putting them in correctly. Additionally, there is a RetroOZ forum page, and this is going to show you specific information related to this firmware in particular. For example, where to put specific port files. And in general, this is just a good place to look if you want to see an archive of some of the development that's happened with this firmware. Either way, between my written guide, the RetroOS page, as well as this ODROID forum, you're probably going to find everything you need. On top of that, the GitHub page that we used to originally download the RetroOZ files also has some handy guides as well. For example, this will show you how to set up the button mapping and what the hotkeys are and things like that. The RGB10 Max can actually have two different control schemes based on where you want to put the start and select buttons. But one thing I do want to note here is the device does have a sleep function. A lot of people think it doesn't. It's just a matter of pressing two different hotkeys, which are the two right function keys on this device. Either way, if you're interested in finding out how to use specific hotkeys, like for example how to turn up the brightness while you're playing any game, this is the diagram that's going to be really helpful for you. Okay, so now that we've talked about resources, let's actually move over some of those game files so we can start playing games. So within that ROMs folder, you're going to find the names of all the different systems that are supported with this operating system. And so to add game files, you're going to want to go into that folder on the SD card, and then move over your ROM files. Like I said before, make sure that you consult the RetroOS webpage to make sure that the file types that you're adding are supported with this operating system. And of course, this is going to require that you add your own game files, which you'll have to do on your own. But either way, the process is relatively simple. Just grab your games, move them over to the appropriate folder, and you're good to go. Okay, so once the game files have been moved over to the corresponding folder, go ahead and eject the SD card, and let's put it back into our device. Okay, so let's make a couple tweaks before we start getting into games now that we have everything set up. First, let's go into the Options section, and then select the Device folder. There are two different RGB10 Max functions, and it all depends on where you want to have your Start and Select buttons. The device itself is labeled to have Start and Select on the bottom, but I prefer to have those keys on top. So I'm going to select the control scheme that puts the controls back on top. It's going to take a minute to go through this process, but as you can see here, the Start button is now mapped to that top right button. So some other things we can do is adjust the brightness. You can also use the hotkeys for that. For example, I'm going to use the bottom right button as the hotkey, and then I'm going to press up until the brightness is at full capacity. And one thing to note is the RetroOZ firmware is actually brighter than the emulate one. And that's because they made some kernel updates that make this display a little bit brighter overall. So if you find that the stock operating system is a little bit dim, RetroOZ will be a great firmware solution to make the device a little bit brighter. Okay, so let me show you a couple other tweaks you can do. For example, the RetroOZ firmware has some background music that is playing, and if you don't want to hear that, you can go into the main menu, then sound settings, and then turn off the front end music. That's definitely going to be a personal preference. Also, within the main menu, you can go into the UI settings and then change out the various themes that are available in RetroOZ. And these are all preloaded, which is really handy. So if you want to try out some of these and get a different feel for your operating system, this is the way you would do it. For example, I really like the NES box theme. This is actually the default theme with ArcOS, and so it just feels nice and clean. That being said, for this video, I'm going to use the original RetroOZ theme just to keep things standard. So yeah, we've made a couple tweaks now, and we're basically ready to start playing some games. And the way you do that is basically navigate to the system, and then choose your game, and then start playing. For now, we don't have any fancy box art or videos that are going when we navigate through the system. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. For now, let's just start up a game. One thing you'll notice about RetroOZ is they've pre-configured a lot of the graphical settings so that you have the optimal gameplay experience. For example, the NES was a 4x3 system, but this is a 16x9 display. Well, on RetroOZ, he's already pre-configured a bunch of bezels that'll show up on the sides of the display, so it fills up those black bars you would typically see when playing a 4x3 system on a 16x9 display, and personally, I really like having these bezels, so to me it looks really nice. So now, let's talk about how to get box art and other media onto the user interface. First thing you want to do is make sure that your Wi-Fi switch is set to on the top of the device. After that, go back into the options section, and then select Manage Wi-Fi. It'll already have an existing Wi-Fi connection here. Either way, go up to that Ethernet section, hit the A button, and then select Delete. That's going to allow you to add a new one. Use R1 to get to the plus button, and from there, choose your Wi-Fi network. After you add in your password, you're actually connected and good to go. So use the shoulder button, go to the X button, and then hit A to exit this menu. From there, you can go down to the network information section, and then verify that you're connected to the internet. You'll know that it's working when you see an IP address here, and you'll also see an indication in the top right of the banner here that'll show you that Wi-Fi is connected. So, now that you're connected to the internet, let's go ahead and add some box art to one of these systems. Let's start with the Sega Game Gear. Press Start to enter the main menu, and then go into the Scraper section. In here, it's going to ask you for a username and password. To do this, you're going to need to make a free account over at screenscraper.fr. After you register with them, you can add in your password, and that's going to make scraping a lot easier. Now within here you can change out whatever parameters you want. For example, by default the image source is a screenshot, but I personally like to see the box art, so I'm going to change it to boxart 2D. Additionally, I like to see videos. This can actually slow down the menus a little bit, but I do like seeing them, so I'm going to turn that on as well. After that, you can select Scrape Now, and then start the scraping process. For now, we're only going to add media to the Game Gear games, but you could do this for all of the systems. It's going to take a couple minutes, and then it's going to say refresh your games list in order to see the new box art. To refresh the game list, go into the Quit menu and then select Restart Emulation Station. After that, you can navigate to whatever system you just scraped for us it's a Game Gear, and now as you navigate through that menu, you're going to see box art. Also, because I scraped videos, if you hover over the game for a little bit, it's also going to show a video. Now, this feature is totally optional, but it is something that does improve that user experience, at least for me. And like I demonstrated with the Nintendo games, this will show you bezels on the left and right to take up some of that extra screen real estate. I really appreciate the fact that RetroOZ does this by default. Okay, let me show you some of the other things you can do within the menu to improve your experience. For starters, let's talk about the different emulators you have available. If you go into the main menu and then emulator settings, you'll see all the various systems that are supported, and some of these systems have a variety of emulators to choose. For example, with Nintendo 64, I prefer to use the standalone Mupen 64 Plus emulator. But you have other ones available if there are certain games that don't work well with that one. Now this device has an RK3326 chip inside, which is not the fastest chip in the world. But if you do a little bit of tweaking, you can get a lot of Nintendo 64 games to play well. For example, you can see that F-Zero X here on the Nintendo 64 is running at basically full speed. One of the downsides of the Mupen 64 Plus emulator is that it can't show you the frames per second, but either way, the gameplay itself does feel smooth. But in general, some of those harder to play systems like Nintendo 64 or Sega Dreamcast may require you to go in and tweak the emulators for certain games. One of my favorite things about RetroOZ firmware is that it supports widescreen Dreamcast games. And I have a whole video that I've made about this, and I'll have it linked in my written guide. But honestly, this is one of the things I really like about the RGB10 Max. Because it has a 16:9 display, you can do things like play games in widescreen. Another note I'd like to make is that if you are going to add Dreamcast games to your device, I recommend trying out the European versions of these games. And that's because a lot of these European ROMs will allow you to choose between a 50 or a 60 Hz signal. And if you choose the 50 Hz option, it's actually going to make a lot of these games run more smoothly, because they're not trying to push out 60 frames per second, instead they're doing 50. And sure, the games might not be quite as smooth as the American counterparts, but at the same time, I'd rather play full speed of 50 Hz than have a degraded performance when trying to run 60 Hz. So that's my recommendation if you are going to play Dreamcast games. Try to get the European ones, and also choose 50 Hz if it's available. Now, like I mentioned earlier in this video, this is not my RGB10 Max. I'm using somebody else's, and I replaced the screen on it. And that's because he was having all sorts of visual issues. But unfortunately, once I installed the new screen, I found that it still had some flickering on the right side after the device had been playing for about 20 minutes or so. And while it's not a deal breaker, it does get annoying when you're starting to play it. And it doesn't happen to everybody, but it is something I noticed on this unit even after changing out the screen. So I did a little bit of troubleshooting. The first thing I did is I reseated the ribbon cable, just in case I hadn't put it in properly the first time around. And initially I thought that had fixed it, because I didn't see any of that flickering. But as we'll see later in the video, as the device starts to warm up, the flickering will come back. Anyway, not a huge deal, but something I wanted to mention if you do see the flickering later on in the video. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the graphic options that you have when playing games. In particular, this is going to be important for Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and Genesis games. When you first start any of these systems, the device is going to look very smooth. But if we go into the RetroArch settings by pressing Select and X, and then we navigate to the Settings, then Video section, you can see that bilinear filtering is turned on. This is an option that's going to smooth out any uneven pixels in the display. The problem is it also softens the image. So say we turn off bilinear filtering. One of my favorite ways to judge this is by looking at the Mega Man X life bar. The fact that you can see these black bars in between the life bar is an indication that the pixels are uneven. So the easiest way to get an even and sharp display is going to be to change the settings to integer scaling. So we're going to go back into settings, then video, then scaling. And within here, we're going to turn on integer scaling. Now when you jump back into the game, you can see the life bar is correct, but the display is a tiny bit smaller than it was before, so you can see a little bit of black bars on the left and right. And that's because with integer scaling, it's only going to scale up the image to round numbers, so this is a 2x integer scaling happening right here. It's not quite big enough to fill up the whole screen, but all the same, it looks really good. Of course, if you turn off integer scaling, it's going to maximize the size of the screen. You're going to have smaller black bars on the left and right, but you're going to have to deal with those uneven pixels. It's really going to be up to you what you choose to tolerate. Would you rather have a big display that takes up the whole screen and deal with the uneven pixels, or do you want to have those perfect pixels with a little bit smaller of a display? Personally, I like to have integer scaling turned on and just deal with a little bit smaller of a display. Either way, once you've made your decision of how you want the settings to look, let me show you how to save those settings. You're going to go back into RetroArch, and within the quick menu, you're going to find an option called Overrides. And there's 3 different options here. Save core overrides means that anything you're using with that specific emulator is going to be saved. Save content directory means everything within the SNES folder. And finally, save game overrides means you're going to save it specifically for that game only. Personally, I like to use save content directory overrides. That means that everything within the SNES folder is going to get saved with these settings. So if we open up another Super Nintendo game like Super Mario World, you can see that it's saved the integer scaling option. The display itself is a little bit smaller than the bezels, but the display is super sharp and the pixels are balanced. Now, what happens if, for example, you don't like to have these Super Nintendo bezels on the left and the right? There is a way to fix that as well. We're going to go back into the RetroArch settings, and within the quick menu, we're going to find the on-screen overlay option. And here, you just want to turn it off. And that is going to remove those bezels. So if you don't want to have any distractions, this is going to be an option for you. Like I said earlier in the video, I do like these bezels, so I'm going to keep them on. Okay, so as you can see here, the flickering has returned on this device. Honestly, I think there's something going on here. Either the ribbon cable is damaged, or there's something wrong with the actual motherboard of the device itself. Either way, so we don't have to see the flickering anymore in this video, I'm going to switch over to my original RGB10 Max. And the nice thing about having the operating system directly on the SD card is that I can just swap it over and everything is exactly how it was. So let's go over a couple other systems and some of the recommendations I have for those. We'll start with Mario Kart on the Nintendo DS. Because you have a widescreen display, you can actually show both screens at once on the device and it doesn't look too bad. But if you click down on the L3 and R3 buttons, you can actually swap between having a full screen display and also swap between which screen you want to show. So depending on what DS game you're trying to play, this is going to be a nice option so you can figure out what you'd rather see. And Nintendo DS works perfectly fine on this device, other than the fact that the stylus input is a little bit annoying. You basically use the right analog stick to control an on-screen stylus. However, for games that use only button controls like Mario Kart DS, it works perfectly fine. Okay, let's take a look at some other systems so you can see what they look like. We'll start with Game Boy. And like with a lot of the other systems, this one comes pre-installed with bezels, and it also uses some colorization and LCD ghosting, so it gives you a very original Game Boy feel. Similarly, the Game Boy Color looks really good as well. But the one handheld system that looks even better than these is the Game Boy Advance. Because this system uses a wider 3:2 aspect ratio, it looks really good on the widescreen 16:9 display. It does still have bezels, but they're very minor. One thing to note about a lot of these pre-configured handheld systems like Game Boy Advance is that they have an LCD shader already applied to them. This gives it an LCD or grid-like effect. Now to find this shader, you go into RetroArch and then go into the shader section within the quick menu. And if you scroll down here, you can see that the applied shader is the LCD3X. And it looks really good, but if you turn off this shader and then you go back into the game, what you'll find is that removing the LCD grid makes the display a lot brighter. So if you're playing any of these systems in an environment that requires a brighter screen, my recommendation is to remove this shader. Okay, so the last point I want to make is about PSP performance. And unfortunately on RetroOZ, PSP doesn't work very well. If you start up a game using the default emulator, you're going to find that everything runs really slowly. And there are other hacks and tweaks that you can do. For example, you can turn on skip buffer effects, but I found that it didn't have any effect on the gameplay itself. So my next step was to turn on frame skipping, but surprisingly, even this didn't work. So no matter what you set on here, it actually doesn't affect the gameplay at all. Frame skipping doesn't actually frame skip. So we can go into the emulator settings and try out some of the other different emulators. For example, we can switch from the standalone emulator to the standalone Go emulator. But unfortunately, it was the same case with this one as well. The games run slowly, and if you change the settings in the menu, it actually doesn't change anything. So let's try a different emulator. Instead of trying the standalone ones, which usually perform the best, let's try the RetroRun emulator. And sure enough, this one does play at full speed, at least with Lumines. Now the thing about RetroRun is that it doesn't have an on-screen menu, so you can't actually change any of the settings. And while that doesn't matter for a game like Lumines, it does matter for more 3D intensive games like Ridge Racer. As you can see here, the game is not playing at full speed, and you don't have the ability to make any changes to improve the performance. So if you're really interested in having PSP gameplay on this device, unfortunately RetroOZ is not an ideal solution. In this case, and only in this case, I would recommend using Emulec instead. Although this device is not supported officially by the Emulec team, the version of PSP on Emulec does work. It will allow you to go into the settings and turn on things like auto frame skipping so that you can play certain games at full speed. Now that being said, this chipset is not very good at playing PSP in the first place, so it may not be worth this trouble of having two different SD cards, one for PSP and one for everything else. It's really going to be up to you whether or not it's worth that trouble. So the last thing I want to touch on before we close out is the available ports that are in RetroOZ. As you can see, a lot of these ports have already been preloaded and pre-configured. That being said, for any of the games that are not open source, you need to provide your own data files. So if you try to open up something like, say for example, the Sonic the Hedgehog widescreen port, it's not actually going to boot up. When you try to boot it up, it's going to say, hey, you need to add your game data files. Same thing with something like Shovel Knight, it's going to say, hey, you need to add those files first. And luckily, I've made videos about almost all of those ports already. So if you go to the RGB10 Max starter guide, which I have linked in the video description, it's going to walk you through all of these different things in written form. For example, if you want to set up widescreen Dreamcast, it'll have a link there to the video and the written guide. Additionally, I've linked to all the available ports guides as well. But really, that's about it for this video. I wanted to show you how to get RetroOZ up and running on the RGB10 Max, and some of the tweaks that you can do to personalize this experience for your device. So as always, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.